Good morning, friends. Today we are going to learn the third part of Module 8 for your semester 6th for the paper Introduction to Literary Criticism. The part 3 of Practical Criticism. In the first part, we learn about what is practical criticism, critical appreciation. In the second part, we learn about how I. Richards write down about the practical criticism and how he point out what are the difficulties of the critical appreciation and what should be the points for critical appreciation. In this particular part, we are going to learn about the structural devices, sense devices for the critical appreciation and the sound devices. These three parts are the important one, and practical criticism in it particularly we are going to learn about the critical appreciation of the poetry. There are some devices used for the criticism and the critical appreciation. What are the tools and technique for appreciating poetry? That tools and techniques used by I. Richards and how the practical criticism is presented by I. Richards is important for your critical appreciation of any poem. It was I. Richards who began practical criticism as a pedagogical discipline. He mentions in his book entitled Practical Criticism, a study of literary judgment, that he had taken the term from Coleridge. The tools, techniques suggested by I. Richards are very much useful for analysis of a poem. Those tools and techniques will be useful for you people also for analysis or the appreciation of the poem. L.J. Alexander too gives certain devices which would be of immense use for students in proper interpretation and understanding of a poem. There are some important tools and techniques which are useful for the critical appreciation or analysis of the poem. The first is figurative language. Figurative language means the figures of speech. How figures of speech, which you had already learned in your 12th standard for your compulsory English, that is figures of speech like repetition, metaphor, metonymy, simile, those kind of figures of speech used by the poet. This type of, that's why it is called as a figurative language. This type of language includes different symbols, figures of speech, etc. All these generally have something different to say from as they appear. Carelessness in reading would bring students in trouble. Hence, they must go through these terms carefully. So, students, you people must know what are the figures of speech and how you are going to use in your critical appreciation and search out from that particular poem which you are going to analyze. Second part, sense and feeling. It includes that how you are going to use the figures of speech like simile, metaphor, personification, hyperbole, metonymy, synecdoche, etc., which are related to the sense devices and the feelings. While appreciating a poem, students should concentrate on the interrelation of sense and feeling. Sometimes feeling is generated by sense, but sometimes it happens in opposite way too. So, opposite way, the sentence implied the another meaning. It is very simple sentence, but poet want to suggest the different meanings from it. So, sense and feeling, this is also the important device for the critical appreciation of the poem. Next, tone and intention. What kind of tone is used by the poet is important one. Students should try to enter into the mind of the poet so that they would be able to understand the tone and intention of him in creating that poem. It would lead them to proper meaning of a poem. So, due to the tone, student can understand, you people can understand how the poet used the different devices and what kind of language used by the poet. Next part, melody. In order to understand melody or music of a poem, students should know something about meter. While writing a poem, the poet may take the help of some meters, that iambic pentameter, and most of the time we learn about the meter of iambic pentameter. All of you know what is the structure of it and how it is used by the writer is important one. So meter is the most important part at the time of the critical appreciation, which is related to the rhythm of the poem as well. That is, iambic pentameter has unstressed followed by stressed syllable. So there are 5 iambic feet in the poems. So in that way you are going to use and write down the critical appreciation of the particular poem. Most commonly used meters are iambic and trochee. Sometimes anapes, dactyl, sponde, etc. are also used by poets. Such meters and figures of speech like alliteration, onomatopoeia, assonance create rhythm and music in the poem. So, this kind of figures of speech used in the poem and create music in the poem that is called, that might be called as a sound devices as well. L.G. Alexander gives 3 types of devices, that is, which would help students to appreciate poetry. They are as follows. First, structural devices, that contrast, illustration, and repetition are known as structural devices. Those are also related to the structure of the poem. What kind of structure is used in the poem is a part of critical appreciation. They try to bring vivid picture the poet wants to create in the poem before our eyes. So, contrast is the first, that is most common of all structural devices. Here we find 2 completely different pictures side by side. Sometimes this contrast can be seen very easily, but sometimes it is implied or suggested indirectly. So, the poem and the used contrast to show the different meaning, or use the comparison for the poet for the poetry writing. Next is illustration. In order to express feelings of the poet, idea or experience, the poet presents a vivid picture in the poem. So, if we take example of Tennyson's Break 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 poem, he presents the picture of a fisherman's boy, the sailor lad, and the stately ship. By these illustrations, the poet points out that life goes on even though someone dies or suffers. It never waits for anyone. So, the illustration is the second part structural device used by the poet. Next is repetition, that poets often repeat single lines or whole stanzas at intervals to emphasize a particular idea. Such repetitions serve at least two purposes. They create musicality in the poem, and secondly, they draw our close attention to some core thought or main idea in the poem. All of you know the famous example of the rhyme of the ancient mariner. Coleridge repeats the words water, water everywhere, and all the boats and shrink. Boats did shrink. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. See, the particular word water is repeated to show particular core thought or idea in the poem. Next is sense devices. Sense devices which are related to the simile, metaphor, personification, or metonymy, synecdoche, pun are the sense devices. They create a peculiar effect because they bring together unrelated ideas or objects. If we see the figures of speech like simile and metonymy. In metonymy, the literal term for one thing is applied to another with which it has become closely associated because of recurrent relation in common experience is important in the figures of speech of metonymy. Next is pun. Pun denotes a play on the words that are identical in sound or very similar in sound but are sharply diverse in significance. So, the wordplay in the figures of speech, pun is important one at the time of critical appreciation. If we think about the figures of speech as a sense device like simile, that a comparison between two different things using the word like or as. Example, we can take example of Robert Burns' poem "Oh My Love, Like a Red Red Rose," and the another example, an ice must high came floating by as green as emerald. See, it is compared with the emerald, and the first example, love like a red red rose. It is compared with the red rose. Next example is of sound devices. These include alliteration, onomatopoeia, rhyme, assonance, etc. They add considerably to a musical quality a poem has when it is read aloud. Those sound devices, rhyme is important one, that this usually occurs at the end of lines in poetry and consists of words having the same sound. For example, bright and fright, mile and tile, moon and shoon. So, rhythm, rhyme together. Skillful rhyming is very important in metrical compositions. Usually, there are rhyming words in succeeding lines or alternate lines. So, rhyme is important sound device in the poem. Next is about co- assonance. This occurs when the poet introduces imperfect rhymes. For example, break and rock, grind and ground, speak and break, etc. Sometimes the poet uses it deliberately to break the monotony of jiggling patterns. This helps to carry on the onward flow of movement and thought. So, this kind of sound devices are used in the poems. If we take example of the rhythm, that is much there is much similarity between poetry and music. So, when the poem is read aloud, we can hear a definite sound pattern in the lines of a poem. It is called rhythm and it is the most striking of all sound devices. It always helps to convey the poet's intention and gives the reader some indication of the poet's mood. Rhythm is an ingredient part of any type of poetry, whether rhymed or unrhymed. So, here is an example about the rhythm. The fair breeze blew, the white foam flew. See how these lines are create a rhythm in the poem. Along with all the tools and techniques mentioned above, students should be aware of different types of pattern poems. The knowledge of such type would help students to know the intentions of a poet. The most common types of poems are as follows: descriptive, reflective, and narrative and lyric. Descriptive main function of such poems is to describe people, scenes, experiences, objects, etc. minutely and clearly. Such description creates vivid picture of the things described before our eyes. Next example, next type of poem, reflective poems. These types of poems are thoughtful. Such poems contain much description which the poet comments on or from which he draws conclusions. Sometimes these conclusions are directly stated and sometimes implied. Next is narrative. These types of poems narrate a story. If we see example of Rhyme of an Ancient Mariner, we can understand how it is a narrative poem. They are longer than other types of poems. They are easy to understand the poet's intention. Next is lyric. The lyric is a short poem like a song, and usually it is the expression of a mood or feeling. So there are those types of poems. Again, we learn about the poems types, that is elegy, ballad, ode, song, and lyric. So they are categorized as reflective poems, narrative poem, descriptive poems. So in this way we learn about what are the devices used in the poem and how we are going to recognize it at the time of critical appreciation of the poem. So these devices, that is structural devices, sense devices, sound devices, and again the types of the poems, that is descriptive, reflective, narrative, and lyric, are important parts and the devices for the critical appreciation of the poem. So remember those points for the critical appreciation of the poem and try to remember the figures of speech and learn the figures of speech which are used in the poems. So, in the next lecture, we will learn about the next part of it. Till then, stay safe, stay home. Thank you.